Hello, I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Last week in Seoul, U.S. and South Korean officials reaffirmed their alliance and expressed solidarity in dealing with North Korea. The occasion was a 2+2 meeting between Secretary of Defense Austin, Secretary of State Blinken, and their Republic of Korea counterparts. Secretary Blinken said the U.S. remains, quote, committed to the denuclearization of North Korea, reducing the broader threat the DPRK poses to the United States and our allies, and improving the lives of all Koreans, including the people of North Korea, who continue to suffer widespread and systematic abuses at the hands of their repressive government, unquote. A North Korea policy review is underway inside the Biden administration, but there are no easy ways to guarantee peace or make the peninsula nuclear-free. While North Korea continues to refrain from conducting ICBM or nuclear tests, that could change with little warning. Even more likely, North Korea will fire up other systems, kinetic and cyber, military and space, as it continues to refine its arsenal of strategic weapons. Whether a nation or alliance is deterring the leader of a state adversary or negotiating with him, it's essential to understand his ambitions and fears. This program aims to analyze North Korean threat perceptions and their implications for the alliance. The fundamental question is this: how can allies preserve stability, build a more durable peace, and avert a potential nuclear conflict? North Korea can demand significant attention, but engaging North Korea can yield little progress. Conversely, ignoring North Korea to focus on the wider Indo-Pacific can also invite miscalculation and mischief from Pyongyang. The specter of past North Korean provocations led me to write a new report entitled Fear and Insecurity, Addressing North Korean Threat Perceptions. Let me say just a few words about this report, which was generously supported by the Korea Foundation and is freely available on the Hudson website. Then I will introduce our expert panelists and solicit their wisdom on North Korea and the U.S. South Korea alliance. In Fear and Insecurity, I consider how the use of force and the threat to use force is understood by North Korea's three Kims, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. Objectively, it seems Kim Jong-un has more to fear internally from a pandemic, economic failure, or a coup d'etat than he does from external attack. This may not have been the case for Kim's grandfather or father. Relations with North Korea have evolved, but it's also possible to view North Korea's use or threat of force as a continuum, with various inflection points involving a recalibration of force, diplomacy, and other measures. I write about the 7 political military campaigns that began with conventional warfare in 1950, led to brazen commando attacks, including the Blue House raid in 1968, followed by low-level military engagements, including the brutal axe murder in the DMZ in 1976, the resort to terrorism and assassination, including the 1983 Rangoon bombing, followed by nuclear brinkmanship in the 1990s, the return to limited lethal force and a focus on building nuclear-armed missiles in the 2010 to 16 period, and Kim's determination to complete an ICBM while relying on threats and high-level diplomacy to deal with the Trump administration. Now, some wonder why Kim has remained relatively quiet since the election of Joe Biden. Provocations may be forthcoming, but Kim may be undertaking his own policy review, considering the best mix of threats or even limited uses of force and other policy instruments to help him achieve his goals. And what he appears to want is nuclear weapon status, possessing weapons that can deter U.S. and allied attack, as well as sufficient relief from sanctions to meet his internal needs. One lesson for me is this: arguably not since Operation Paul Bunyan, when we mobilized large forces for the discrete goal of chopping down a poplar tree in the DMZ, has North Korea taken our threat to use force so seriously. As a result, the regime has found ways to exploit our threshold that would trigger the use of deadly force. This gives Kim Jong-un leeway to create problems and pursue an ICBM and other weapons without fear of starting a war or an attempt at a decapitation strike. This reality sets boundaries for negotiations, deterrence, and defense. The bottom line is a strategic stalemate. We're unwilling to force North Korea to disarm and equally reluctant to accept North Korea as a permanent nuclear weapon state. Well, now, to discuss these and other issues, I'm delighted to join 4 truly distinguished analysts and practitioners on North Korea and the U.S. ROK alliance. General Vince Brooks, U.S. Army retired, was the 4-star commander of all U.S. forces in Korea, the UN Command, and the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. His entire military career is a record of achievement that began at West Point, where he was selected first captain, the leader of all 4,000 cadets. Vince Brooks is now chairman and president of the Korea Defense Veterans Association. Dr. Andrei Lankov is a director at NK News. It's the must-read analysis on North Korea's site. And he's also professor at Guman University in Seoul. His deep understanding of North Korea was advanced early on as a student at Pyongyang's Kim Il-sung University. His authoritative books and prolific analysis portray North Korea in the round. Evans Revere is one of the best American diplomats covering Northeast Asia to emerge out of the State Department in my lifetime. Fluent in Korean, Chinese, and Japanese, he has extensive experience in negotiation with North Korea and served as the principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He was also DCM and Chargé d'Affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, and he's currently Senior Director with the Albright Stonebridge Group. And retired Lieutenant General In Bum Chun served as Deputy Commander of the 1st ROK Army, and before that as Commander of the ROK Special Warfare Command. The most highly decorated ROK soldier since Vietnam, General Chun is credited with saving ROK JCS chairman's life after being injured in the '83 Rangoon bombing, and he holds a PhD in political science. So with that, let's dig in. Let's begin with General Brooks. Welcome all, but General Brooks, how has the alliance positioned itself for threats or the possible use of force by North Korea, and how do you look at these issues that I've just presented?
Well, first, Patrick, thank you so much for inviting me, and what an honor it is to be with such a distinguished panel of people I admire and respect. I would start by saying that it's interesting, you brought out in your opening that there has been a pattern of predictability that the alliance has created in many ways by preserving the armistice, and that North Korea found what the limits of the will were for the alliance and whether or not the alliance would commit to a military action directly against North Korea. And the pattern over time is, no, it will not. I will tell you, this is one of the objectives of the alliance, to change that perception in the 2017 period of time, where we very much changed up the playbook in terms of how we responded to North Korean threats and provocations to try to achieve a degree of deterrence, which we were not succeeding in. We certainly had succeeded in conventional deterrence, that is, that we prevented the resumption of conventional war on the Korean Peninsula, but the pursuit of nuclear capability and intercontinental ballistic missiles especially, not to mention the regionally threatening intermediate range and medium range ballistic missiles as well, that effort was now about showing North Korea that the game has changed. Especially so after the ICBM launches of July 2017. So the playbook was different. When they fired, we fired. We had ballistic missiles also in the air the same time they had ballistic missiles in the air. We conducted bombing missions, not dropping bombs on North Korea, but flying in a completely different pattern that they could not expect and could not respond to. And we actually saw that they did indeed notice those things and that it had a consequence on their calculations. So I would say the alliance has continued to posture itself in a way that sends a message of strength to North Korea, and yet does not intend to provoke or to initiate the resumption of war. This is a very delicate balance that has to be maintained. And it's critically important that military effort is fundamentally tied to the efforts to create diplomatic traction, economic effect with regard to sanctions, and international solidarity. All of these things are combined in many ways. You know, as the Biden administration now in office and already rolling, having just come through, I would say, very productive set of engagements throughout Northeast Asia and beyond, they face a North Korea with nuclear capability, with intercontinental ballistic missiles. These things are already in place. A family of missiles of various ranges, as I alluded to, one of the largest conventional military forces in the world, the largest special operations force on the planet, one that General Chun wish he had one as large as that, but his was better, and one of the top 5 offensive cyber capabilities in the world also, which we should not discount. And despite decades of crippling sanctions, they've been able to achieve this. And especially in the face of the international sanctions imposed in 2017. I'm of the view that the nuclear arsenal is not an end unto itself, but rather a lever to gain and maintain the attention of the United States and the international community to achieve a deeper purpose. And the challenge is finding that deeper purpose of what it is that North Korea really, really wants. The administration also inherits the season of symmetry as it was in 2018 and 19. It is now halted, but it is not foreclosed. It inherits the comprehensive military agreement of 2018 that succeeded in lowering military tension while maintaining pressure on a broader basis. And it inherits a North Korea that desires dialogue with the United States, yet will make, as we all know, every step painful in achieving any kind of constructive dialogue. I'd just make a couple more points real quickly. The administration, I say, also inherits the alliance dynamics that had been skewed by nationalistic ideologies in both countries, and an alliance that was put under pressure by external relationships with China, Russia, and Japan. So having said all this, I remain with the view that the door is still open to change the dynamics on the Korean Peninsula. And that is even with the harsh rhetoric from Kim Yo-jong and then Chae Son-hee a few days later. Both of these, however, did not foreclose direct dialogue with the United States. And it's my view that Kim Jong-un in North Korea wants change, but he must accomplish it by seeking to control the pace of engagement with the U.S. and also with South Korea. And he will, of course, seek to engage the two separately and under the best leverage conditions that he can muster. And so there's an opportunity for the alliance to realize that North Korea's economic security and their military security cannot be guaranteed by China, especially since North Korea doesn't want that to be the case, but rather that a new future, this is my opinion, a new future will come through a relationship with the United States and the Republic of Korea. So the ultimate challenge then for the Biden administration is finding the right combination of actions, coupling pressure on North Korea and engagement with North Korea, increasing the solidity of the Iraq-U.S. alliance, and keeping the international community constructively engaged to bring about peace on the Korean Peninsula, free of nuclear arms. I'll stop right there and look forward to the rest of the conversation tonight.
Well, those are great opening comments. We'll get back to some of this, but I want to turn to Andrei Lankov and get his kind of long view on the Kim elite, the Kim family, and what they think about the use of force, the threat of force, and maybe what even keeps Kim Jong up at night, if anything. Andrei, over to you.
Well, I don't think he has ever had a good night sleep because he is doing an extremely dangerous work and he is highly unlikely to die a natural death, and he knows it. Having said that, well, what is their major goal? Right now, I would say survival. Historically, they used to dream about conquest of the South. And this dream will probably come back eventually, but not right now. The North Korean elite cares about survival because they face a very unusual situation. We tend to forget that when you have a normal dictatorship, a normal authoritarian regime, no matter which type, if this regime is removed, usually it's only a handful of people who are replaced. And these people normally, well, sometimes bad things happen to them, but normally they still count on comfortable retirement somewhere, maybe a year in prison or two, and then writing memoirs how they have always been right. In North Korea, it's seriously different. First of all, when you are running such a repressive regime, your chances of surviving its collapse are not very high. But what is far more important for us? Imagine, well, look who is, say, now running Russia, or for that matter, nearly all post-Soviet states, including states which have very good relations with the United States. Former Communist Party apparatchiks and bureaucrats. The top class changed, but the elite in general remained. It's not going to be the case in North Korea. So if there is a regime collapse, not only the top 100 families, but top 10,000 families will lose power and privilege. So elite is united. and they believe that they are facing a serious threat. And I would completely agree with Patrick, because he said that under Kim Jong-un, the threat is more internal than external. We should not discount external threat. They saw what happened in Afghanistan, or say in Iraq. But what is significantly more important for them is Libya, a combination of the domestic revolution, which is probably happening anyway. They might persuade themselves that it was a result of some CIA covert actions. Irrespectively, it can happen just because South Korea is across the border and so attractive, and they're in such bad economic mess. So it will happen, and then it will get outside support. So survival is their major concern. And this is why, and unfortunately, I believe that their fears are first, deep-rooted. You cannot persuade them that they are safe. Second, you cannot persuade me, yours truly, that they are safe. Unfortunately, I believe it's a very their assessment. I completely agree with their assessment of situation. They are running an actually hungry tiger. And this is a bad news. Because you cannot, yes, they have the second option, so as a second goal after survival, economic growth. But it's a very distant second. They don't want economic growth if they are dead, or out of power, or in prison. And this is why all diplomacy's two strategies are based on the wrong assumptions. People usually say them, commit suicide or we will kill you, maybe. Well, I believe choice is obvious, not commit suicide because it's certain death. Or we'll give you a lot of money if you commit suicide. Well, not a good idea. You have to be alive first, and then you can be rich. So they believe that nuclear weapons guarantee them from Iraq scenario, Afghanistan scenario, and their worst nightmare, Libya scenario. Because if you have a revolution in Pyongyang, and we also know that North Korean government can use nuclear forces for any kind of involvement, everybody will be careful. And by the way, I'm pretty sure they care not only about the United States, but also about China. Of course, US is number one in the threat list. Well, this is a major policy, and this has been always the case, and it's not going to change. And this is why they need nuclear weapons. There are three additional major survival deterrents, not only against foreign attack, but against foreign intervention into a domestic crisis, Libya style. Make sure nobody will be talking about, right to protect and everything. Having said that, there are three additional goals. Basically, first, as General Brooks mentioned, it was has always been important for diplomacy. Right now, it's probably less important, but they survived their worst crisis essentially using nuclear-based blackmail diplomacy. Some people say, let them eat nukes. Thank you very much. This is exactly what they are doing, have been doing for decades. It's how they are squeezing aid from the outside world and attracting attention. Let's not forget they basically have economies the size of Ghana and Mozambique. Second, it's first additional goal. The second additional goal is domestic, for propaganda purposes, for getting support from the military. Well, maybe the money used for economic, had this been used for economic development, they would yield better results, but still it helps. And finally, I have just 30 seconds to finish. Finally, I would say that they still deep in their dreams, they think about finishing the unfinished business of 1950. It's not that they are going to do it now, but they have a dream of basically blackmailing Americans, making basically shaking American commitments, maybe getting Americans out of the region, and then finally finishing what they could not finish in summer 1950. But let's not fool ourselves. It's not what they are going to do right now. It's a distant dream. But it still exists. However, number one is survival. Number two is diplomatic tool. And number three is domestic policy, and a distant four, still existent, the great dream of Korean unification under Kim's family. It's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrei. I mean, we went from, I think, the very hopeful remarks of General Brooks and very confident to the grim realities of North Korea, quite frankly. I want to turn to In Bum Chun, General Chun, and ask him from the perspective of the ROK military and from his own experience, whether it's now or historically, how does the ROK look at North Korea as a threat? How seriously do you take those threats? And how would you view the threat perceptions that we've been talking about here for the Kim regime?
I absolutely agree with General Brooks' assessment as well as Professor Lankov. In South Korean society, there's a wide spectrum of opinion about the North Korean threat. On the one side is the view that North Korea is no longer capable of being a threat because because the country is starving, and that the nuclear weapons of North Korea is for self-defense and will not be used as a first strike capability. On the other side of the spectrum is that the North Korean threat is unchanged in its intent to unify the Korean Peninsula by force and will intimidate and extort South Korea with its nuclear capability. Fortunately, despite the wide range of opinion, there is very little room against a North Korean use of force, no matter who you are. If the North Koreans use force, South Koreans expect its military to react forcefully. Now that North Korea has nuclear weapons, we need to ensure that North Korea has no doubt about the U.S. extended deterrence. Therefore, the role of United States Forces Korea is more important than ever because it is a symbol of U.S. resolve for the Korean people. For the conventional threat by North Korea, the South Korean military is confident that we can handle any local provocation from North Korea. Having said that, the lack of a de-escalation measure and the fact that North Korea is investing in its own conventional capabilities are a concern. Finally, the weakest link in the Kim Jong-un-led North Korea is its own people, as has been stated by Dr. Lankov. Therefore, information and truth is our greatest weapon. It seems K-pop and K-drama is more of a threat to North Korean society than any conventional weapon or any kind of defense system that the South Korean military has. So I'll stop there.
Your comments were excellent. And we're going to go to Evans Revere now and take a perspective from a diplomat on how all of these threats, all of these even uses of force in the past have been relatively limited and intermittent. And yet our diplomacy is very much held hostage by the military stalemate that we're in. So from your perspective, Evans, I mean, how does the diplomatic sort of dimension of this intersect with Kim's threat perceptions?
Well, thank you, Patrick, for having me here today. It's a real honor to participate together with my distinguished colleagues in this panel. And let me, of course, thank the Hudson Institute and you, Patrick, for the kind invitation that's allowed me to be here. I feel like I'm a former baseball player. I feel like I'm the cleanup hitter. I've come up to the plate and the three preceding batters have all hit home runs. So what is there left for me to do? Well, let me talk about the diplomacy a little bit here because I think the diplomacy is a key element of what we need to be focusing on right now. Patrick, you wrote a very valuable report that you talked about at the top of the program about addressing North Korean threat perceptions. And in that report, you reminded us very usefully that Kim Jong-un has declared or had declared his nuclear weapons program complete as long ago as 2017. But an interesting question arises, and that is why has he then continued to expand and enhance his nuclear weapons and ballistic missile delivery programs? And even more importantly, why did Kim Jong-un declare in his remarks to the 8th Party Congress in January his intention to develop what he called ultramodern tactical nuclear weapons, hypersonic warheads, multiple warhead missiles, and land and sea-based solid fuel ICBMs? He's doubling down on his nuclear program, he said. The answer to that question, in my view, tells us volumes about whether fear, insecurity, and a sense of threat from the United States, all the things that we've been talking about, or something completely different is at the core of North Korea's plan to greatly enhance its nuclear and missile capability. And let me suggest, my own view here is that the answer is that it's something different. And let me tell you what that is. Kim Jong-un is faced with a new US president whose North Korea policy, of course, remains unclear as the policy review is going on. But just as he did and the regime did in 2009, and again in 2017, in the opening weeks of new US presidencies, Kim Jong-un has decided to preempt the outcome of any US policy review and at the same time remove any uncertainty about North Korean intentions. In doing so, he has emphatically sought to end any discussion of denuclearization. He's reminded us that the DPRK is and is going to remain a nuclear state. And in addition, by announcing the expansion of his nuclear and missile programs, he signaled his intention to compel Washington, or to try to compel Washington, to engage in what the North Koreans have long called arms control talks. If the United States is to have any hope of trying to slow or cap the North Korean nuclear program, he's pushing the United States in the direction of using those talks to try to do that. This gambit to change the main topic of US-North Korea dialogue from denuclearization to arms control was quite frankly hiding in plain sight in the January address to the Workers' Party Congress. Kim Jong-un described North Korea's nuclear weapons development as the nation's strategic and predominant goal, and he called it an exploit of the greatest significance in the history of the Korean nation. Those are not the words of a man who intends to engage in denuclearization talks. He declared that North Korea was going to be a responsible nuclear weapons state, and his message was that the regime is now a permanent nuclear power and Washington must deal with it as such. Those remarks signaled Kim's determination to make a dangerous threat even more potent, and by doing so, to raise the level of urgency felt in Washington about the need to somehow slow or cap the North's nuclear weapons program. A lot has been said about the Biden administration's ongoing North Korea policy review, of course, but Kim Jong-un's remarks to the Congress suggest that Pyongyang has conducted, as it did in 2008 and 2016, has conducted its own policy review. And the result this time is going to be a major challenge for a new US administration still finding its feet as it was in 2009 and 2017. Kim Jong-un's costly move to modernize his WMD programs comes just as the North is in the grip of an economic crisis. The pandemic has decimated trade with China, which is, of course, the regime's economic lifeline. The state planning system is broken, foreign exchange holdings are down, state revenue is shrinking, growth is declining, and international sanctions and bad weather are taking a toll on the economy. But despite all of this, Kim Jong-un is forging ahead, apparently convinced that the benefits of going down this doubling down of the nuclear and missile path, that the benefits will outweigh the economic risks. The benefits, of course, are going to include the prospect of securing much needed sanctions easing in return for vague promises, almost certain never to be fulfilled, putting limits on the North's nuclear program. And let's remember that all the previous nuclear agreements, as well as the Hanoi summit, all collapsed in part over issues of verification and Pyongyang's unwillingness to allow the necessary inspections to take place. North Korea's new approach, the one that we're seeing rolled out before us over the last several weeks, is part of an old strategy. It wants to shift the focus of dialogue with Washington from denuclearization to a new question. And the question is, how can North Korea and the United States manage their relations in light of Pyongyang's new status as a de facto nuclear weapons state. Pyongyang knows that engaging in such a dialogue would essentially lock in the North's nuclear status. You don't have arms control talks with a power that's not a country that's not a nuclear power. And it would also provide a negotiating venue to discuss sanctions easing, as I mentioned earlier. But most importantly for North Korea, it would put, in its view, the U.S. ROK alliance, U.S. troops, and the U.S. extended deterrent on the table for discussion. I don't need to remind anyone that these three things constitute what North Korea has long called the threat that it perceives. So, pursuing this approach, the North Koreans hope to exploit the view held by many American experts and officials that denuclearization is no longer achievable. Instead, Washington should focus on managing North Korea's nuclear threat and constraining the growth of its arsenal. This view, in my humble opinion, is music to Pyongyang's ears, since it would draw Washington into a dialogue not about whether North Korea should have nuclear weapons, but about how many North Korea should possess. Let me just wrap up by saying that with the door to North Korea's denuclearization rapidly closing before our eyes, Kim Jong-un believes he can shut it now and open a new one that is going to lead the country to become a permanently and even an acknowledged nuclear state. And if the Biden administration decides to take that slippery slope, admittedly a diplomatic slope, but a slippery one, leading to arms control talks with Pyongyang, I suspect that he's going to find an eager partner in Kim Jong-un. And I think we're going to find a lot of nervous allies in East Asia. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, Evans, thank you very much for joining the diplomacy to the threat perceptions. I'm going to reverse the order of the questions here. So I'm actually going to pick up with Evans right away here and try to push you further about where this might be going as a result of what you've portrayed. And let me just cite a couple of things that have happened. One of them is the recent extradition of a North Korean businessman from Malaysia. Very interesting. The North Koreans, of course, have objected strenuously. No surprise there, perhaps. But this really does seem to be a potential threat to the illicit economy of North Korea, especially in Southeast Asia, because this is just the first businessman to be extradited. What happens if there are others who are clamped down? So Kim Jong-un may not be getting a free ride on his illicit economy. The second thing is that there really is an escalation potential here. And General Chun mentioned there was no de-escalation mechanism. So quite aside from maybe formal arms control, isn't there a scope for risk reduction with North Korea, whatever its status? Thirdly, do you think North Korea really thinks that it's going to win many benefits and sanctions relief in particular if it's not actually making meaningful concessions about its weapons program? And if not, how do we get out of this stalemate? Or the thesis is the threat of force or the actual use of force the only way, going back to General Brooks's initial point, for Kim to get attention and try to arrest it? And final point here is that if you're in the Biden administration and you're trying to put together an Indo-Pacific strategy, the last thing you want is to be bogged down on dealing with North Korea. You want to be dealing much more broadly with big powers, China, India, bringing democracies together. So just play this out a little bit. Where does this go if this is indeed North Korea's position? And then we'll go back to General Chun and Dr. Lankov, and we'll end up maybe on a positive note again with General Brooks.
You've put a heck of a lot on the table there. Let me just pick up on a couple of points and then open it up for a broader discussion, because I really want to hear others' thoughts on this as well. It seems to me that if the goal is to try to reduce the risk, you need a cooperative partner on the other side in order to do that. Let's go back through the record of the 1994 Accords, the 2005 Agreement, the 2007 Agreement, the Leap Day Agreement, and of course what happened in Hanoi. On every one of those occasions, at the end of the day, what we discovered was that North Korea's lack of sincerity and lack of commitment to the notion of denuclearization prevented the North Koreans from engaging us in a constructive way in a number of efforts, all of which were designed to do exactly what you described, which was to limit, bound the program, and ultimately reduce it if we could. None of those efforts worked. I was involved in several of them. And despite the sincerest efforts of all the players, other than North Korea, of course, we failed in doing that. And we're now faced with that problem again. And once again, the North Koreans, I think, I would agree with the point that you made and that others have implied, that there is a North Korean interest in having a dialogue with the United States and a negotiation with the United States, but not about what we think they want to talk about. It's not about denuclearization. That's pretty much off the table now. There are ways, I still think there are ways to achieve denuclearization of North Korea, but I fear that the center of gravity in terms of US thinking about this is shifting away from pursuing aggressively the idea of denuclearization and holding it up as a sort of a hopeful wish for the future, and trying to sort of cap or bound the North Korean program. But we've been down this path many, many times before. And the dialogue that took place in Hanoi in particular was prima facie evidence that the North Koreans were engaged in an effort to elicit the maximum number of concessions from the United States, particularly in the sanctions area, in return for vague promises. And at the same time, as we saw from what happened in Hanoi, the North Koreans began to redefine what constituted the thing that we wanted to freeze. All of a sudden, facilities that used to be within the Yongbyon complex and have always been considered as such were now no longer part of that complex, according to what the North Korean leader supposedly said in Hanoi. There were nuclear facilities that we knew about, and the North Koreans know we know about, outside of Yongbyon, that were completely outside the bounds of what North Korea was prepared to freeze or cap, if you will. And you can't cap things that you can't see and that you can't monitor and that you can't verify. And that was the essence of the pushback we got from the North Koreans in Hanoi. I could go on with a number of the other points, but I think that's the core point to make, is that we're dealing with a power here that intends to remain a nuclear force at some level. And regardless of what that level is, it's going to be someplace around where they are today. And they will not allow us to peer behind the curtain to see what it is that they're usually doing. So an accord that seeks to cap or bound the program is almost by definition going to be something that you can't really rely on. Let me stop there.
Well, let me turn back to In Bum and get a reaction from a Korean perspective on how the South Korean government as well views the potential for engaging North Korea in this environment. And given what Evans has said about what their goals may be, denuclearization is something off the table. They might be willing to engage in arms control as an equal. If we go back and replay the Hanoi summit and end it differently, we stay for lunch and we make a deal to kind of take it the next step, step by step. I mean, how does that kind of process look from the perspective of a military professional and an analyst of your own government's thinking?
Since you asked about the present government, I will base my comments on the public announcements that the Moon administration has been making on this matter. And they want engagement. I think their perspective is that North Korean nuclear weapons is not a threat to South Korea. It's a regime survival defensive mechanism. And although the Moon administration objective is denuclearization, what they're doing and saying is far from that. They would like denuclearization someday. One has to wonder what would be the benefits of a North Korean nuclear state, a weapons state. And I might sound kooky, but I just want to say this. Let's just say we acknowledge that North Korea is a nuclear weapons state. For one thing, it would cause a headache not only for us, but to China. So, there might be benefit in that. Secondly, it could guarantee more inter-Korean exchange, which the Koreans would like to have. The more inter-Korean exchange that we have on the Korean Peninsula, it will affect North Korean society. And I think that is something that North Korea leadership will have a difficult time handling. So I think those are some of the benefits that we might see from a nuclear armed North Korea. Having said that, as a South Korean who believes and is scared of North Korean weapons, that doesn't make me feel any better. So I would just say that just last week, Congressman Steve Chabot mentioned that in order to denuclearize North Korea, the US government should be thinking about discussing nuclear weapons for South Korea and Japan. I would say that that is a great option. Why can't we talk about this? If South Korea were to become a nuclear threshold state like Japan, or even further, it would scare the Chinese and maybe put them to do some action. And if the South Koreans did become a nuclear weapon state, I would feel much better. Now, this does not marginalize the role of USFK. We still need the United States Forces Korea here even more, even if South Korea had nuclear weapons, because we need the United States as a stabilizer now. I think the North Koreans would soon realize that a nuclear armed South Korea with the United States here is much better than a nuclear armed South Korea alone against their own regime. So I think these are some of the things that can be inputted into the new equation thinking. Because, gentlemen, quite frankly, we are at an impasse. We've done everything before, and it hasn't worked. And we need to shake things up a little bit.
I want to go back to Professor Lankov, Andrei, and ask you, from the perspective of North Korea, if you're trying to forget denuclearization and maybe pursue something that would be beneficial by an arms control regime that Evans Revere was talking about, or if you're General Chun and you're talking about potentially acquiring nuclear weapons or more strategic weapons by South Korea and Japan, how do those look in North Korea, do you think? I mean, what are the prospects that the Kim regime sees, either from arms control negotiations, if you will, or from potential military sort of augmentation in the region?
Yeah, I would say probably repeat the last sentence of General Chun. We are in an impasse. Because I've been doing North Korea for 35 years. And I've seen this pendulum in Washington moving between hardline and soft line, neither producing any impact. I have been spending 20 years writing that neither side is going to get things done. But US a democracy, and they have a habit of regime change every 4 or 8 years, and every time they start anew. And it's a bit sad. So basically what I would say, first of all, North Koreans will never accept non-nuclear status. If it means serious risks, they will not accept it. If they are losing a lot of money making opportunities, they still will not accept it. They will keep some kind of nuclear potential. They will probably, their dream is official recognition. They are happy to have India or Pakistan or frankly Israel level of tacit acceptance. And frankly, I believe they will get it. Because, we can say that we never accept North Korea as a nuclear country. It's a bit like saying they are not going to accept the laws of physics. It's a nuclear country. They have bombs which can explode, and they have missiles which can fly. So talking about them, it's something non-negotiable. And I think that arms control is the only way to go, but I completely agree that it should never be accepted too openly. What I mean, I think that arms control talks should always, for decades, continue under a smoke screen. Basically, they had to be presented as the first step on the long way to the eventual denuclearization. The denuclearization should remain officially declared goal with full understanding that it's not going to be achieved, because if we openly jettison denuclearization, it will destabilize the non-proliferation regime and create a lot of different troubles. So what I would say, I think it's acceptable for the North Koreans to arms controls. And of course, it's necessary to have a bargain on every point. And of course, it's important to keep deterrence high. And in this regard, I have a good news as somebody living as a foreigner living in Korea, Korean-speaking foreigner. I see changes, serious changes in the public opinion here. I've never seen South Korea so pro-American as now. And what is even interesting, a dramatic decline, a dramatic change in attitude to China, which was even surprising for me. Over the last few years, the image of China deteriorated a lot, including the political forces which were traditionally quite mildly pro-Chinese. Having said that, I think that it's a way to go, but what I would like to attract attention, as again, General Chun mentioned in passing, and I believe it's extremely important. No matter what we are doing with North Korea, the only long-term solution is to change the nature of the North Korean society. And the best way which can be done is through exposing North Koreans to the knowledge of the outside world. And I mean everything from student and academic exchanges and visits of North Korea, high-level North Korean delegation, to sending a USB and a radio broadcast. There are many ways to do it. There are many, shadows of this, and it's not what North Koreans are going to like. And what is important and often overlooked, Kim Jong-un now is taking the foreign disinformation as a serious threat. Unfortunately, he is taking it far more seriously than his father, and recently we have a massive campaign. But talking about, having said what I have said, unfortunately, I'm quite skeptical, because the idea of arms control, even under smoke screen of the dishonest commitment to the eventual denuclearization, is not going to sell well in the United States. I'm 57, and I strongly expect that I spend another 30 years looking how Washington pendulum is going between doves, and who will say, well, we have to find, we have to promise them a lot of money, they will see the light. And hawks who will say, wow, sanctions are beginning to bite. I have heard about sanctions which are beginning to bite since 2006. So I'm a bit of pessimist if I think about what's really going to happen. But I think that arms talks, and of course, at the same time, trying to change North Korean society from within. Yeah. And by the way, we had great opportunities to change it just 10 years ago. It was missed exactly because occasionally hawks, occasionally doves persuaded the top leaders in Washington and elsewhere that the solution is just beyond the corner. And we had so many opportunities to basically flood North Korea with information. Not anymore. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrei. I have sort of two different questions for General Brooks, for Vince Brooks. One of them was just one out of interest, because we've emphasized cyber and information. And I'm wondering, when you were commander of U.S. Forces Korea and UN Command and the Combined Forces Command, how well you thought the command was integrating information, cyber, into not just the military command, but what you also saw in general through policy and connections. But a different question, a very different question from the cyber and information, is even if North Korea really is this ambitious and this difficult, as we probably know it is deterrence really that difficult? I mean, we have tremendous military capability between what you and General Chun have spent your lives on in terms of a professional military inside ROKA, inside the U.S. And whatever North Korea builds, it seems to me that deterrence can be held at a reasonable cost, and that you can further strengthen the U.S. ROK alliance as a bulwark for democratic support for the rules-based system and for other goals in the long term as well. That may be too optimistic, but the point is, How do you feel, General Brooks, about the prospects for maintaining deterrence and using the ROK-U.S. alliance for regional security and beyond?
Well, of course, everyone's comments have been excellent, and they certainly reflect that there are different views about how to approach North Korea. That is part of our challenge and has been the challenge over many, many decades. How do you really approach North Korea? What works? And the answer is nothing yet. And so how do we know what the right way forward is going to be? And I begin by thinking about the nature of deterrence. Now, this will sound perhaps a bit strange from someone who's been engaged in deterrence for much of my career. Deterrence is about preventing something from happening, but it also is about preserving some degree of status quo. And if we're not satisfied with status quo, then the approach to deterrence must change also. And that may mean a very different approach to causing these things to happen. If we want to change away from the status quo of North Korea being unapproachable, North Korea taking inches instead of feet of progress steps, North Korea pocketing any progress that might occur. If we want to change that, we need to think about it differently. You know, one of the things I do in my retired life is I'm on the board of an oil and gas company. And it's interesting that for so many years, one would drill for gas and oil a certain way, vertically. And now they've changed to a horizontal drilling. Who would have thought it? And it's a much different outcome. Well, the metaphor here is that we need to drill differently to get to what it is we really seek. Now, let me get to the point about cyber and information integration, as you brought it up. This is an interesting challenge. First, the good news is South Korea has taken on to the recognized need for an integrated approach to cyber. They've organized their own cyber command. It is a partner with the U.S. Cyber Command, so the military structure is there. And the national structures are also well connected in addition to that. That's a good news story. At the same time, the challenges associated with cyber operations are myriad, not the least of which is the trade-off between intelligence value and effective cyber operations. If you have a good target and you decide to prosecute it, that target is probably going to move, or you may have an effect that changes then the environment. And you lose every bit of intelligence that comes with it. So it's not so easy to say we have a good cyber instrument. You know, I'd say the United States is probably best in the world at it. North Korea is probably number 5 in the world. They're very good at it also. But they have fewer challenges, legal challenges, the challenges that are associated with sovereignty in different countries, the effect on international communication structures and infrastructure. All these things are challenges that face rule of law countries, not autocracies. So the challenge is much more great for the alliance than it is for North Korea. Having said that, there is great improvement that can be made. And we're engaged in some work to try to streamline our processes, how we would nominate something to those who had the actual authority to execute it. And that work needs to continue. It has to be practiced. That's why we have exercises, and that kind of thing needs to be part of the portfolio of events that the alliance is engaged in. Let me just finish on a couple of other points here. I do believe that as we think about a broader Indo-Pacific strategy, there will be a feeling of, hey, we've got other things we've got to do. The United States, its allies, the Quad, others, we've got to turn our attention to something else. But my view is actually this. If we're thinking about the geopolitical relationships with China and other countries, but especially China's presence and their influence in that geopolitical sphere, we shouldn't think differently about the Korean Peninsula as a place where that can be manifested. All right, so China's influence is very clear in North Korea. They are not allies, but they do have considerable leverage over top of North Korea's behavior and its economy. And it's especially through the economy that they have this. Is that really something we should accept for the future? Are we okay with that? Do we want to yield to China's influence the outcomes on the Korean Peninsula? It is China that has left North Korea a basket case for these years. China could long since have improved North Korea's economy in the same way that the United States enabled the emergence of South Korea's economy. And China has not done it. And they will not do it because it is not in their interest. North Korea is probably seeking something very different in terms of security guarantees than what we've been thinking about. So I would tell you that we must not miss the signals when North Korea is signaling that they're reducing military authority, as they did in the Eighth Party Congress, that they're doing a generational change of leadership, which they did during the Eighth Party Congress. And that, yes, they may talk about the greatest weapon ever, but that's more to appease the hardliners in country and get room to change the North Korean society from the inside, not from the outside. Kim Jong-un is the one who wants to change North Korean society. How do we help him do that in a way that changes the geopolitics of the region? That is a much more complex challenge, and that is horizontal drilling. That's horizontal drilling. We need to approach it in a completely different way.
Well, General Brooks, those are brilliant comments to end on, and maybe the whole next report needs to be on theories of change, and understanding Kim's theories of change. But what is our theory of change? Thinking about China's theory of change. We could go on for hours if we had the time. We don't have that. You've done a brilliant job in 1 hour or less. And so, General Vince Brooks, Lieutenant General In Bum Chun, Evans Revere, and Dr. Andrei Lankov, I'm extremely grateful to you on behalf of Hudson Institute. Thank you for your deep insights and experience and sharing this with us. And if you're watching this show and you've enjoyed it, please look out for the part 2 in this series on North Korean threat perceptions when we look even further at the diplomatic implications. Thank you very much, and good day.